Your podcast is a powerful tool that serves your audience and your business. But how do you manage it all, bring in new listeners, and convert those listeners into customers? That's what this show is all about. Welcome to Podcasting for Educators. I'm Sarah Whitaker, classroom teacher turned podcast manager, and I'm here to help you get the most out of your show, all while making an impact on other educators. Welcome back to another episode of Podcasting for Educators. Today, we're looking at a very important piece of podcasting that I view as a must for all podcasters, and that is show notes. Now, before we get into that, I just want to remind you that I am doing a giveaway right now in celebration of my 50th episode. I'm giving away a $50 Amazon gift card and a Podcasting for Educators Arctic tumbler. To enter the giveaway, it's super easy. All you have to do is download or take a screenshot of my podcasting bingo board. You can find that in the show notes for this episode at podcastingforeducators.com/episode 51. Or you can just click on the description for this episode and it will be there as well. All you have to do is mark off 3 things in a row on your bingo board and add it to your Instagram stories to show me what you've marked off, and make sure that you tag me at Podcasting for Educators. And if you do a blackout, if you cross off everything on your bingo board, that will be an additional entry. The giveaway ends on July 29th, 2022. Okay, so show notes. First, let's define exactly what show notes are, because people often think of them as different things. I define show notes as a post on your website for each specific episode. It's typically a summary of some sort of the episode, and this is different from what I call the episode description. The episode description is what you see as a listener within your listening app. So if you listen on Apple Podcasts, when you click on the episode, there will be a description in Apple Podcasts for that episode. As far as the structure and what to include in your show notes, there's lots of different ways that you can set this up, which I will be going over in detail in the next episode. But think of it this way. You should have a tab on your website labeled podcast. So when somebody goes to your website, at the very top, when maybe you've got your home page, your about page, a contact page, a resources page, a blog, maybe if you're a blog writer, there should also be a tab that is labeled podcast. Don't try to make this any kind of cutesy name, just name it podcast so that people know exactly where to go when they're on your website. When someone clicks on the podcast tab on your website, that will take them to a main podcast landing page. And this can be really, really simple, or it can be more elaborate. But typically on this page, you'd have your cover art, maybe your trailer, if you have a trailer for your podcast, a description of your show, and some places where people can listen. I always recommend including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music. Let's see, what else am I forgetting? Spotify. Of course, Spotify. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. So this is kind of set up in the exact same way that a blog is set up. On this main podcast page that I was just talking about, you'll then have thumbnail images for each episode. And when someone clicks on each image, it will take them to the show notes for that specific episode, just like you would with a blog. You'd have your main blog page, and then they would click on the image to go to that specific blog post. So essentially, your show notes for each website is just like a blog post, but for your podcast episodes. And like I mentioned before, what you actually include in your show notes can vary in many different ways, and I'll go into specifics in episode 52, but I do want to mention, if you are listening and you are a prep school student, there are 2 lessons in the course specifically about show notes that also include templates for show notes to get you started, and also some tips on how to make sure that you're writing them in an SEO-friendly way. Now that we've defined what show notes are It's really important to understand why you actually need them. Number one is that when you have show notes on your website, you have the ability to now drive your listeners from their listening app to your website. Why is this important? Because when you can get people to land on your website, they're able to learn more about you. They're able to see any kind of paid offerings that you have, any of your resources, or a membership or a course that they could join. Ideally, you want to have a pop-up set up so that when anybody new comes onto your website, they get a pop-up from your email provider that asks them if they want to join your email list. So it's a great way to drive listeners to your site so that you can capture their email address. The second reason that show notes are important is because it has the ability to increase your searchability online as long as you are creating them with SEO in mind. And that is what we all want as content creators. We want to be found in the search engines when people are searching for solutions to their problems that we have the answers to. So creating show notes for each of your episodes is going to increase the chances of people finding you for exactly what you want to be known for. The third reason why they're important is because, and this depends on how exactly you write your show notes, but it can often make your content a lot more accessible to people if you include things like a transcript or even if it is a detailed summary covering the things that you're teaching or that you're covering in your episodes. So for anybody who has a hearing impairment, they can still go and consume your content through your show notes pages. And then a fourth reason why you want to have show notes for each of your podcast episodes is because now each of these show notes pages kind of acts as a home base for each episode. And then you can use that page, that show notes page, to link to things on different platforms, specifically Pinterest. Show notes are great for Pinterest because it gives you all of this content that you can create pins around, and now you have something for people to link back to. Hopefully now you can see why show notes are so important and why you're really kind of missing out if you don't have show notes for your podcast. If you've had a podcast for a while now, but you don't have show notes, you haven't started yet, I would suggest starting now. You can keep it really simple in the beginning and you can always adapt as you go. Today, something that you could do is to go and check out some of the show notes pages for your favorite podcasts and see how they've set things up. And that will kind of give you some ideas on how you might want to set up your show notes. In the next episode 52, I am going to go over best practices for show notes, give you some important things to include in your show notes, and give you suggestions on different ways that you could format them. Before I go, I just want to remind you one more time, don't forget to enter the giveaway in celebration of 50 episodes of this podcast by downloading or taking a screenshot of that bingo board that you can find in the show notes at podcastingforeducators.com/episode 51. I will see you in the next episode. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. To keep this conversation going, connect with me on Instagram at Podcasting for Educators. I'm always looking for an excuse to talk about podcasting. If you're looking for support in launching, managing, or growing your podcast, check out my online course, the Podcasting for Educators Prep School, at podcastingforeducators.com/prep school. I'll see you here next time.